additional trainings as part of the series. We just to kind of loop back to sort of where we started and what we hoped we would accomplish together through this series. Our hope was that by the end of the series, participating learners, that's you, had the potential to have a full project plan and corresponding concept note. We don't expect that you're there today. As you see the dates, we anticipated that the work would continue till the end of April, and we will continue to be available through the WhatsApp group and all of that to continue to support you in finishing off those pieces. But if you have been coming out every week or on the alternating weeks, you've gone now through the process of building out a theory of change, logic model, thinking through risks, thinking through your monitoring and evaluation plan, building a budget. And then we talked also about how to take what you've developed in your project builder, combine that with the basic elements of your case for support to be able to develop a concept note and move forward in trying to get your project idea funded. So we're jumping ahead a little bit today. This training isn't necessarily going to contribute to getting you funding, but we did also just want to sort of close that loop of assuming you are successful in getting funded for your project idea. At some point, you're going to want to communicate the impact of that project back out to various stakeholder audiences, starting, of course, with your funding partners, but also thinking about all of the other audiences that are impacted by the program or have been participating in the development of the project that you're going to want to share information with about how the project went and the results of that work. So we're jumping ahead to impact reporting for what do you do down the road once you started implementing your program and you're starting to see results or observations or impact that you want to communicate back out to your audiences. We're going to look at various audiences and various approaches that you can use to communicate your story effectively. I'm going to be using the word story and storytelling quite a lot as we go through today, and we're going to talk about why as we get there. But I do think it's a great way to sort of frame the way we think about communicating impact, because it really is, regardless of what donor audience you're talking to, it really is a story, right? It's a story of what has happened. It's a story of positive change, and how we communicate that might be different. But if you think about things from the perspective of it being your story, the story of your project, the story of your participants, the story of your stakeholder communities, then that's a really good way to start when we think about impact reporting. So impact reporting essentially is about telling you the story in the right way to the right people. So the first question that we need to ask when we think about communicating impact is, who should we be reporting to? Then, what is the story of impact that we want to share? And then how do we best share that story with the audiences that we've identified? So we're going to start by thinking about the who. So who is it? Who are the stakeholders that we need to report to? Because reporting is not just about reporting to your funder. Impact reporting is really about being open and transparent with all of your stakeholders about the progress you're making and the results of your project. It can be a really great way to maintain and even strengthen relationships by building trust, strengthening engagement, and really fostering learning. So the first groups, let's get it out of the way, funding partners and donors. Obviously, this is a stakeholder group that has an expectation of receiving reports and information about impact that may be contractual. So you may be entering into a contract that lays out the frequency and the style of format that you use to report back to your funder, to a funder. Local officials in your impact community, if there's anyone that you liaised with to facilitate the development of the project or getting permissions to do certain activities, or who have an interest in community development outcomes in a particular place. Of course, your project beneficiaries, project participants are also a stakeholder audience who have a vested interest in understanding the change that you've observed and what's taken place. Knowing their individual experience is a different thing than understanding how their individual experience was part of something bigger. Okay. Other NGOs or CBOs or organizations, institutions that are working in your space or place may be interested in knowing more about the results of your project. It's an opportunity potentially for them to learn. It's also potentially an opportunity for you to learn. The more you share, the more feedback you might get about an experience they've had that you can use to strengthen what you're doing. And then, of course, there's internal audiences as well. This is actually an audience that sometimes gets overlooked. So as we go about work, there might be other people engaged in your organization who really have a vested interest in knowing that your work has been successful, but may also just enjoy the opportunity to hear the story, right? If they're a board member, for example, and they spend most of their time thinking about budgets and sort of governance issues, having the opportunity to really understand the work that's happening on the ground in communities is going to help them feel more connected to the cause, right? Connected to what the organization is accomplishing, and that's going to help them to be more committed and do their jobs better as well. Is there anyone that you can think of that I haven't named here that you consider to be a stakeholder that you would report to? Anyone I've missed?
Yes, Diana, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to share one experience that it's with one of our donors. I really don't see additional stakeholders. I think this list is so comprehensive, but one of our experience is with a donor. So even, I mean, we have implemented, in addition to the regular reports, we have implemented some like check-in meetings or meetings just to check. And we have also shared with them, in addition to the project, information about our organization, how we are going with other projects, how it's going the organization, and really through this kind of more comprehensive reporting and try to engage them more like a partners instead just like a donors for a specific project. It has helped us a lot to gain knowledge because like the team is really experienced, so they have support us in a lot of aspects, also introducing other supporters, other donors, and also investing in additional aspects of the organization. So I think this is like a kind of really key concept, and not just doing the report because you have to do it, but more in understanding the reporting part of the project, like an strategic part to engage more all the stakeholders. So I wanted just to share with you this experience that for us, it has been really a key way to engage them more like a strategical partner, just like a donor that start the project and end the project, and we just provide the report.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Diana. Great points. All right. So once you've figured out who you're going to be reporting to, the next step is to think about what the story is that you would like to share with those audiences. So that can start with your analysis of any monitoring and evaluation data that you've collected. So as you're looking at the results of your data, it could be from focus groups or interviews or surveys or any of your other monitoring tools, but you start to look for trends, right? You start to look for what is the impact that you're seeing from the data that you're looking at. So what has happened? And then thinking, but why does this matter? And then where do you go from there? So what's next for these beneficiaries? Of course, keeping in mind that data itself is not the full story, right? Data is the evidence that you might give to explain why your story has unfolded the way it has, or to provide proof that the story you're telling is accurate and reflective of what you observed throughout the project. But it's one piece of the story, and it does require some context, and it does require some explanation, right? Before you can actually go and tell that story to other people. So here's an example of M&E data, right? So here's just a sample project we made up, but these are the kinds of data that you might be looking at according to your indicators and your targets that you've built out connected to your logic model. This is just a snapshot. If you've built out your M&E plan in the project builder, this is of course what it looks like. It's not just though about numbers, right? So numbers on their own are not a full story. So what is the story that the data you're looking at is telling? What is the setting? What is the context? What is the action or story arc? So what was the catalyst for the change that you see in the data? What are the trends? And then what are the outliers? So was there anything unexpected? Where did you miss a target? And what did you learn from that? And how can that be explained and understood by the rest of your stakeholders? Who are the different characters in your story? So who were the people who were participating in the project, either as delivering services or activities, participating in services or activities, other stakeholders that were involved and engaged throughout the process? And how were people impacted differently? Were men impacted differently than women? Were there children and adults participating and getting different kinds of benefits or being impacted in different ways based on their age? So again, I'm taking your data and starting to use storytelling words, characters, plot lines, action, story arcs. Okay. So some guiding questions that you can ask yourself when you're thinking about the what is the story? So what was the setting? What kind of picture can you paint or help people understand where this story took place, where the project took place? What did you do? So what were the actions that took place? How did people change? So you might want to focus on your immediate level outcomes. So what was the tangible change that resulted from the actions that you took? Okay, so the knowledge, capacity, access level change. And then how did their lives change for the better? So thanks to the tangible change that occurred as a result of your actions, how did their lives improve? What was the impact it had on their lives in terms of change in the way they are now acting, their behavior, their experiences? This is drawn right from your data, right? So we have you're already collecting data to measure your impact at both the immediate and intermediate level outcomes. But when you think about how you're going to communicate that back, you may not actually write the words immediate level outcome indicators, here's where we hit target, here's where we didn't, is a different way of speaking about it than to say, we did this thing and it had this impact on how people understand an issue. And that has changed lives by impacting behavior, right? It just changing the way the words that you use to talk about the same thing and turning it into more of a story that you can then share with others and be understood. So then the next piece of the analysis is, you know what happened, but why does it matter? Why is that something that people should find compelling? Okay, what is changing as a result? So this higher level impact of how people's lives have changed, does that connect to something bigger? If a collection of people's lives change in some way, what kind of overall bigger picture change does that contribute to? You can use, of course, your ultimate outcome as a starting point for that you can make a link between what you've achieved in the project as contributing to that larger cause that motivated you to develop the project. providing real examples of that change, helping people to your stakeholder, your audiences that you're reporting to identify on a human level with the change that you're describing by providing, say, case studies and examples of real people's lives. And that what lessons are there to be learned from that? So what could you and your stakeholders that you're reporting to learn from the story of your project to use in other projects, perhaps, to strengthen our own understanding and practice and efficiency and effectiveness in doing this work? And those lessons can be positive. They can also be lessons about challenges or things that did not go according to plan. Those are sometimes even richer as far as learning experiences. So some guiding questions for this second piece of so what? Okay, to ask yourself. So how does this contribute to overarching community needs, project goals, or stakeholder interests? In this case, the story you tell might be a little bit different depending on the stakeholder. So if you know that your stakeholder is particularly interested in the gender equality piece, then you might focus more of the story you're telling to them on the connection to gender equality. How does it align with national, regional, or international policies? You know, does the country that you're working in have a national goal that's then connected to the sustainable development goals on a global level? And your project is in some way contributing to those bigger changes, right? What was surprising? That's actually my favorite question to ask when trying to understand the story that the data is telling is, what is the most surprising? Because that's the piece that's going to be really interesting to think about and try to understand, and where there's opportunities for learning because it was something you didn't already know was going to happen, right? And that's where you can learn and grow and discover new things and new ideas. And then finally, overall, what did you learn along the way? And what are you learning from looking at your final data? The last piece of the story you're going to want to tell is what happens next. So this could be what you will do next as a result of the project. Might be that you're going on to phase 2 of the project. It might be that you've now got proof of concept for your project idea, and you're going to take that to scale, to other communities, to other partners. What will people experience next? So now that the participants in your project have experienced the change they've experienced through your project, what do you expect their lives will be moving forward? How does that continue? How does that impact continue and carry forward in their own life experience? And then the last thing is, what should the stakeholder do next based on what you're reporting, right? Reporting and telling the story of a project, it's maybe the final chapter in this one project, but it's not an end, probably for any of you, right? Certainly not an end for you and your organizations, because you're going to carry on and do more of this work in some way, some shape or form. It's not the end for those community members, because they have come out the other side of their project participation changed in some way, right? And that's going to continue to be part of their lives moving forward. For your stakeholders, including funders, it's not the end for them either. And ideally, it's not the end of your relationship with them, right? So being prepared to sort of tie your report into whatever next steps you're hoping they will take, either in their relationship and partnership with you or in their work in that sector. You be prepared to include that as part of your conclusions with the story that you're telling in your report. So the guiding questions that we can ask ourselves is, what are you expecting or hoping to see next? What are you planning? What will you do next? And how are the answers to these first two questions different based on what you've learned in this project? So maybe at the outset, you were hoping to get proof of concept for your project idea with the expectation of scaling quickly. Maybe you've learned that before you can scale, there's something else you need to do in this particular community. Maybe the project was missing something. Maybe you've learned something that means that you have to go a little bit deeper. Or maybe you've learned something that will impact how you choose the next community that you're going to work with. Maybe something was learned through implementing this project about a connected need or gap in the community that you're then now going to go and address. So ideally, everyone comes through a project experience changed in some way, having learned something, having grown in some way, and that should impact your decision making and the choices that you're going to make in terms of your next steps, right? Any questions about these guiding questions for how we identify the story and start piecing together the story from our project data? Okay. You can always put it in the chat and Katie will flag it and make sure we get to it as we go.
Yep, I just got one comment from FISA, just about if you're using a CAP survey, so a knowledge, attitude, and practice survey.
Okay.
You can, yeah, this is probably in the first section, the what section.
Yeah.
If the gap reduced during the project. So you want to look at how people's knowledge, attitudes, and practice are changing, and how you can tell the story about that. Did you want to say anything about that, FISA?
No.
Go ahead.
I was just trying to share the idea that the reporting can help you to show if there's the gap between knowledge and attitude. I mean, is reduced or filled, something like that. I mean, that is very good to show in your reporting, because that will make you to proceed with another project or do something maybe you find during your project. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly like if you're using, say, a CAP survey connected to a project that's about, say, training, right? Being able to point to report back to your stakeholders, not only to say, we did this training and 30 people showed up and it was great, to be able to say, hey, and we have evidence that the training was effective and that these 30 people walked away with new knowledge, new understanding, and changed attitudes. And we can show you that data in some way to prove that point that we, right? Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. So once you have sort of this sense of the story that you have observed, right? The story as you see it from your the project data, from what you've seen along the way, from what you and the participants have experienced along the way. You then also want to do a little analysis of your stakeholder audiences. Okay, so thinking about what is the right story or the right way to frame your story for the audience that you're reporting to. So what do they need? What do they want? And then again, back to this piece, what do you want from them next? And finding this little sweet spot here of what you think is important, what you want to say, the story you want to tell, and what your audience is interested in, where those two overlap in this little Venn diagram here. That's going to be the most important part of the story you communicate, because it's the piece that connects to them in their interests, but also is reflective of the story of the project as it occurred. Okay. So on the what do they need? First, let's talk about contractual obligations. Obviously, with a funder, you may have committed at the outset to report in a certain way at a certain time. So you may already know exactly what kind of information they want you to report. But the other question to ask is, what is their role? So who is the stakeholder, and what are they going to do with the information you share? If it's a funder or a donor, are they going to use that information to decide whether they want to fund you again? Are they going to use that information for their own fiduciary reporting so that they have all of the paperwork in place for their jobs? Like if it's an institutional funder, right? You might report to a project officer. That project officer needs information from you to report to their boss or their manager, right? So thinking about what they need to be able to do their job or to use your information in the way that they need to, okay? It could be a government official who might need to use that because they're responsible for having overall data and understanding about any community development activities happening in the region that they under their purview. Could be another NGO that needs to understand what worked and what didn't about your project to help them strengthen their own practice. So that's what I mean about their needs as relates to their role. So how are they going to use your information? And then what do they want, which is a little bit different from what they need, right? Because a need is you can meet the need and it's a checkbox, but what do they want to hear? What's going to make them interested? What's going to make them want to pay attention? So what are their personal priorities? And this can be as institutions or as individuals within those institutions, right? What are the issues that matter most to them? You mentioned earlier, you know, if there's a group, a stakeholder that's particularly interested in gender equality, then you really need to make sure that the story you tell to them connects to gender equality, because that's going to be the hook that makes them interested and makes it matter to them. If their connection, if their interest is poverty reduction, again, then you're going to want to tell your story in a way that connects to poverty reduction, make it clear for them, because that's the hook that's going to make them interested in the story you're telling. So thinking about their connection to the issues and to that particular community. And then another good tip is to think about how they present information themselves. So are they, when you've met with them, or if you look at the way they share information, whether it's a stakeholder with a website or the way they talk about things when you've had meetings with them in the past, are they super formal in the way they present information? Are they really interested in numbers and graphs and charts? Are they more conversational? Are they more casual? Are they looking for case studies or examples? So you can learn based on how they present information and use that as a guide for how you then present information back to that stakeholder. And then the last piece is about what next, right? So what do you want from them? And that's going to change, that can influence the way you present your story. So thinking about what power or influence do they have that you want them to deploy to support future projects or to support that community in some other way? What do you want them to take away from the story, other than, you know, thinking about what you want them to think about, but also what do you want them to feel, right? How do you want them to respond as people to the story and the information you're sharing? And then finally, what action do you need them to take on your behalf? Okay. So if you think about, let's use the example of a funding partner. Kind of like the group that maybe similar to what Diana was talking about. Okay, so you have an institutional funder that's or donor that's given you money, right? And that institution is actually a collection of individual people, right? You might be sending your reports, sharing your information with one person at that institution. That person is like a gatekeeper. They are your entry point to that institution and to the funds of that institution. And you can help strengthen the relationship by making sure you give them what they need, and they can check off all of their boxes and do their job effectively. And that's wonderful. But if you can also help that person to feel something, to be inspired by your project and the story you're telling, for them to connect on a personal level, they might do something more, right? They might not just check the boxes and say, yep, complete, and file your report away. They might talk to their manager about it, or talk to their colleagues. They might say, you know what, this was a particularly compelling project. I really liked working with this group. I think they did something above and beyond. Like, they might take a personal interest and become a personal champion even for the work that you do, if you can really respond to them and report to them in a way that connects to them in a real way, meets their interests, and makes them feel something as well. Anything anyone wants to add to this? Anything that you like to think about when you're thinking about how to report to people, or especially maybe to a donor or a funder in this case? So again, thinking about that sweet spot between what you think is important and what the audience that you're reporting to thinks is important. And then trying to focus your reporting and storytelling as much as possible on what is relevant to both of you. Okay. So once you've got a sense of who you're going to be telling your story to and what the story is that you are going to tell, there's different ways then of telling that story, right? Picking the right format and approach to how you share that story is also really important. And there's lots of different ways to do this, okay? And here I'm probably going to be touching on things that you might not think about as stakeholder reporting. You might think of it as fundraising or communications, but really these are all connected, right? The way we talk about our work, the stories we tell about our impact and our projects, regardless of the audience or the format that we're using. Obviously, the first one is a formal report, and this might be contractual. It might be the way you have to report to a funder or a government official, for example. And that's a perfectly legitimate way of communicating your impact. But there are lots of other ways that you can do that. And even within a formal report, the words that you choose and what you choose to focus on can be different, right? So articles, blog posts, infographics or data presentations, news style videos or audio reports, speaking engagements, being part of a panel discussion, putting on a webinar are also all ways that we report back. Diana mentioned Diana mentioned even meetings, right? Even having regular meetings where you're sharing observations and talking about what's happening is a way of sharing your impact and communicating with your stakeholders, reporting to your stakeholders as well. Does anybody have any other examples of how they've shared information about their project? Okay.
Yes.
Oh,
Isaac, go ahead.
okay.
Okay, so
Hi,
for
Isaac.
us, the things we ensure we do is to also document the project activities and the results that come out of it in a report, like either a briefing paper or any policy document that could serve as a guide to others, one in projecting what we're doing, the results we're achieving, and also using it to call attention of other influencers or stakeholders who might be interested in taking things further. So we do that regularly as part of our reporting method.
Sorry, I don't know why this just came up on the screen here.
Yeah, that's great. A proper paper report or briefing can be a good tool that you can use as a future leverage, right? To continue that project or start others.
Mm-hmm.
Attention in detail to what you're doing, yeah. So a formal report has worked well for you.
Yeah, great. So, regardless of the format that you're going to use, whether it's a formal report or other ways of sharing information, applying a storytelling approach can really strengthen your reporting. So even if you are filling out a funder's template and they've asked you to provide certain information, there's ways of providing that information that is going to help the reader to understand, to feel connected, and to be inspired by what they've read. Okay. And that can be applied to how the words that you use, the visuals that you use, the way you present the data. There are things that we can do from a storytelling perspective just to elevate those approaches, to make everything that you're going to do make more sense and be more interesting and compelling. Okay. So when I'm talking about a storytelling approach, I'm talking about using story arcs to connect action to impact. Okay. So sometimes the worst thing I find in sometimes in templates that you have to fill out is you have one section where you talk about the action and what you did, and then the impact of what you did is in a different section, a different question, right? And it can be difficult for people to then make the connection between action and results. So finding a way to connect that into one story so that the impact is very clearly linked to the action and is as a result of your action is important, so that people actually feel inspired by it. Otherwise, it feels, let's use the word flat or kind of boring or just disconnected, right? It's just facts and facts as opposed to something of change and anything that's going to be get someone to feel have an emotional response or a human response to what they're reading. Using that story arc, using vignettes to humanize the story, and using storytelling language can also be helpful. So here's an example of a story arc. Okay, so this is the idea of, this is actually your project, how projects occur. But by telling the story using a storytelling arc, you can make your project sound way more exciting and interesting, right? So you talk about oh no, here's the thing that happened at the beginning. And then we geared up our response and hooray, we created this impact. And this is how people are going to move forward. It makes the work that you do, the pinnacle, the sort of main action and result of your project, be the exciting part of the story. So everything that came before and everything that came after, really the focal point of the story is the action and the result, the change that you've created. And by situating that change as part of a story, that change becomes more significant and interesting and exciting and inspiring to the reader. Using vignettes or case studies or little examples and stories to populate and show examples of the change that you're describing can also be really helpful. And you can do that even if it's not asked for in your template, right? So when you're answering a question of please describe your project activities, you can just say, we did this training, 30 people attended, this is what happened. But you can also use an example to say one participant is Gloria, and Gloria's experience was this, to provide a personal human example of what you're describing, even if what you're describing is just the facts of what did you do, right? It helps to draw people into the story, because then it makes the story about people as opposed to organizations doing project activities, right? It makes it more relatable. You can also be strategic about which individuals you choose to showcase. If you're telling stories to a stakeholder that's really interested in gender equality, you may want to include a male and female example so that you can show that the project was successful in achieving impact for both. Or to highlight how their experiences might be different, even if they achieve the same impact. You can also, rather than telling full stories, you can achieve a similar result by using quotations or simple like a testimonial, someone describing their experience in their own words, right? And then lastly, even if you are filling out a formal report, you can think about the language that you use to tell your story. Okay, we can run the risk sometimes, I think, of being very technical in the way we describe our project, which is appropriate, I think, to a very small pool of stakeholders. And I think we overlook the fact that not all stakeholders really understand the technical language or really connect with or get inspired by the technical language. So even when you are reporting to an institutional funder, you may find that you can find a balance between providing enough technical information, showing that you know your stuff, that you're up on the jargon and industry standards and best practices and research and all of that, but also you're humans and you're also talking to other humans and you can connect with them better on that personal level if you use a more storytelling language, which is about simple and direct sentences, instead of using, say, complicated sentence structure that can be hard to follow. Being direct about what it is you want to say, getting to the point and being succinct so that you're being very clear and easy to follow, easy to understand about the points that you're making in your story. Using an active voice as opposed to a passive voice. So you did things did not happen. You understand the difference? So saying a training took place on Saturday is a passive voice versus we hosted a training on Saturday is an active voice. And people respond much better to active voices, even when reading technical reports. So using that active voice, talking about what you did, what people experienced, and making sure that the people are doing things as opposed to having things done to them. I can talk more about that if that's confusing, if anyone has any questions about that. Integrating thoughts and feelings into your reporting. And again, even in a technical report, the way people thought about their experience in your project, the way their participation in your project made them feel as people is also valid information and important information, I think, in understanding the impact of your project. Because the impact of your project is never just people received training, right? We provided training to 30 people. No, the story of your project is what happened when they participated in the training. Was it exciting? Was it new? Was it inspiring? Did they learn something? Did they change in some way? So putting the emphasis on the experience that people had is going to be more compelling in terms of impact, but also going to make readers feel more connected to what you do, because we naturally feel more connected people to people than we do institution to institution. Okay. Sprinkling in some descriptive details. So not just we hosted a training on Saturday, but where did you host the training? What was the setting for that training? People came. Who were those people? How far did they have to travel to get there? What brought them in the door to the training? Sort of adding this detail that provides additional context and opportunity to understand and also connect with the story, to be interested. And the last one, which is, I think, a great tip that I came across about not just a year ago, I think, and I've started using it in all of the reporting that I do. I think it's really effective, is the use of rhetorical questions. So some examples of that would be, say in a funder report, you're given a list of the things they want to know, but you're able to structure it in your own way. So using your headlines, your headers for different sections, using rhetorical questions that you then answer, gives it its own, historically, this is actually a really good a tool for getting people interested. Because if you ask a question like, how did women experience the training? And you use that as a headline, and then you provide an answer and a description of women en masse felt the training was like this, and women's knowledge on X, Y, and Z really increased. You're setting people up to want to know the answer to the question you've just asked them, right? And so it makes them want to then read what you're going to write later and the answers that you're providing to those questions. Okay. Was the training successful? Question mark. Yes, the training was successful, and here's how we know that it was successful. Okay. Did women learn? Did women and men have a similar experience? Question mark. And then answering that question makes people want to know the answer and therefore pay more attention and connect more with the information you then share. So here's an example of how we may share a story of training and the impact of that training. What do you think of this description of a training in a stakeholder report? What's missing? What do you like? What do you not like about the way this is written?
I think from my perspective is that, I mean, it's like missing details more about this training, how it's causing improved capacity for natural resource management. So maybe what kind of content, which were the people who participated in the training, and how we can ensure that they can apply the things they learned in the training in really doing an impact in natural resource management. So I think it's like kind of the activities or the activity, and then it's like the impact, but I think it's missing the middle part, that it's how really we can ensure that this training was effective, causing that.
Hmm.
I think that is also very correct, because looking at the statement, we can see that even when the statement tried to point at the results in terms of improved capacity, it was not as the way it was couched is not such that showed that this was an actual result from the training. And then two, who are we talking to here? Who might likely need this information? The tone of the statement does not reflect the stakeholder who might be interested in this information, because the information itself is not adequate, but or it's not tailored to a specific stakeholder who might need it.
Okay.
Thank you both. So context, yes. A couple of comments just to share here. It's passive in terms of what you're just saying, Claire. It's very technical, just facts. and you need the context. What happened? Who did what? What was the plan? What were the results? Who were those 150? So let's see another example. See if we can improve it. So what do you think about this version?
This is explicit, and I think it captures most of the details. And of course, we can see a feedback by quoting one of the beneficiary and what the person actually said. So it gives a detailed explanation. Then, of course, instead of just saying the first week of April, it gives a period. And it was not a blanket 150%. It was so specific. We have 78 women and things like that. I think this is detailed enough.
And also looking at it, the first statement provided the context, giving the background to the training, the gender, and all of that, to say that we trained women who were not or historically, what is it called, excluded people from the process. And then looking at the second statement, we can see people sharing experiences in terms of testimonies of what has resulted from the training. And then the third statement tells us what actually is going to happen next, the next step, or what to look forward. And that, I think it's comprehensive enough.
So this way then of sort of applying that storytelling approach, right? You can see how this could be appropriate even in a formal report, right, to a funder. There might be other details you might include depending on the funder or depending on the different stakeholder. But just by adding some context, painting a little bit more of a picture, now people can picture where the training took place. Oh, it's in a primary school. Okay, I can imagine what that looks like. Understanding who those farmers were, that 78% of them were women, changes the picture, right? So you're adding details and sort of sprinkles of context and in contextual information that helps people to understand what that looked like, right? What that experience really was. And it makes it about the people instead of it being cold, just the fact, a training was done, these people participated, the end, right? So you can integrate this into a formal report. You can integrate this into how you talk, the story you tell in a face-to-face meeting. You can integrate this into how you present the information in various formats, right? But using the storytelling approach. My last comment just about the words, then we're going to talk about visuals and how to paint, to tell your story with visuals as well. But when it comes to the words, also don't be afraid to be real and approachable about it, okay? In a report, it can actually work against you to try to oversell the impact. So to try to paint a picture that is 100% good news, that everything went smoothly, everything went according to plan, everything is wonderful, can actually make it seem inaccurate or like there's something missing, because we all know that nothing ever goes completely according to plan or completely smoothly. And if you are telling a story of your impact and there was nothing surprising, the takeaway from your stakeholders are either you missed something because you didn't learn. There was something that you could have learned from this experience that you failed to learn, or two, that maybe your project was unambitious, right? That you didn't push far enough, you didn't engage enough. So you want to make sure that you are being upfront and transparent about what actually happened, not being afraid to admit when a course correction is needed or when you need help or needed help along the way. And then when presenting challenges or failures, you can use the storytelling approach to help the reader to focus on learning and solutions, right? So an example of how you can use a storytelling technique might be, you know, we encountered this problem and here's what we learned and here's the action we took and here's the result. So by the time they're done reading about the challenge that you encountered, they're actually reading about a good news story of how you learned, responded, and continued to make change. So they're not going to be focused on a negative place of, oh, things didn't go according to plan. They're going to say, wow, they continued to create an impact and to learn and to carry on despite this challenge. It actually can be understood in a very positive way if you use that storytelling arc to focus the attention on the action and impact that resulted from the challenge and the learning that you experienced. Helping to lead the reader to where you want them to be, which is the understanding of how you solved the problem. Any questions at all about the words and using storytelling in the words that you use to describe impact?
Have any other examples maybe of reporting on and talking about your challenges? Perhaps it's unresolved or unresolvable in a way. How can you talk about that?
I think being honest about it, and then talking about what you're going to do anyway, right? So it's not, if there's a problem that you can't solve, are there ways or are there actions that you're taking to make sure that that challenge doesn't prevent you from creating impact through the project? What are the changes that you're going to make to compensate for that challenge, right? You know, and I think today the best example to think of would be COVID. Right? If you're in the middle for project work, all of us have been impacted by COVID over the past over a year now, right? And it's had to change the way we're working. None of us can solve COVID. None of us can solve that problem and make it so that we can do our work the way we do when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. But what are we doing to continue to achieve impact in communities despite COVID, right? So how are we working differently? And it could be that you were doing a project where outside of COVID, you might experience one result, but in the context of COVID, that result's just not possible. And so you might need to focus on, unfortunately, we can't get to this place that we were aiming for, but despite the challenges, we are still able to work with communities at this level, and that we have a plan for how we're going to then come back and replicate those other results once COVID's no longer an issue. But for sure, you know, here's an example of any stakeholder receiving a report that doesn't talk about the impact of the challenge of COVID is going to think you're really working with blinders on, right? That you're not really paying attention to what's happening in the community. So you definitely need to be upfront and talking about it, right? About the challenge, because it's very real. Okay. All right, let's look then at illustrating your impact story. So you've got all this wonderful information that you've expressed in words, either through speaking to people or writing down in your report. How can you use visuals to help strengthen your storytelling, to reinforce what you've said using words? This is based on sort of evidence about how people think and how people digest information. And most of us really do respond a lot better to visuals than we do to words. So we remember it better. It makes an imprint in our brain better for most of us, not everyone. Some of us are very words. I'm a words person, for example. But given that we know that most people respond better to visuals, thinking about how we can use visuals to strengthen our reporting is a really good idea. And the reason that we use visuals, so it's not just to make things look pretty. Like we don't just put a photograph in a report just because it looks nice, okay? We use visuals to strengthen our story, and we choose them strategically to help reinforce and provide sort of a secondary piece of evidence almost for the stories that we're telling. Visuals can be used to help turn readers into witnesses. They can be used to help achieve that emotional response or feelings of connection that we want to achieve with our stakeholder audiences. They can be used to draw your attention to a particular really important piece of information that you want to emphasize, you want to burn into people's memory. And it can also be used to illustrate key conclusions. There's different kinds of visuals that we can use and integrate into our stakeholder reporting, regardless of the stakeholder. We would use them in different ways, but we can use visuals for all of our stakeholders. Using photographs is a great example, or video. So anything that's a visual representation of our project work or the people participating in our project. These can be really helpful for helping to humanize the story of before and after. It can help create that emotional response because people can identify with the person they see in the photograph. It can also be used to draw your eye to then a case study that you've got embedded or that you're sharing somewhere in your report. Of course, Kate, you're still there? She's got a camera off, I think, right now, but Kate can provide us with some good tips on how to create photographs that are going to be really helpful to use as visuals. So some of the considerations that I think of, and Kate, here's a place where you might have some others you might want to add. Also, good morning to your cat there who's joined us for the session.
Diligently paying attention.
Yeah, so some considerations when you're thinking of using photographs is to plan ahead, because one of the things that we can do sometimes is we just take photographs of things, of people at the end of our project. And that's a real missed opportunity to show change, right? Because the way people look and behave and interact with us at the end of something is very different. And you're only capturing sort of that one moment. Quality, I think of clarity and resolution and making them engaging. Kate, do you want to throw in any quick tips for that engaging some of those quality pieces?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having photographs that are exposed properly and in focus, particularly when this one, particularly when you're taking photographs of people, making sure that they don't necessarily have to be looking at the camera, but that their eyes are visible in that shot and that they are in focus makes a huge difference as to how much the audience will connect to a portrait ultimately. So that, to make sure that it is in focus, all of that and properly exposed, make sure that the project that you put all of that work into is presented as though it is completely professional, as though you know what you're doing, without photographs that are of that kind of quality. And they don't have to be professional quality, but without photographs that people can connect to, you lose some of that credibility that you've built up with in all of your work. And it's a tough one because it is, right at the end. And when you're trying to grab that audience, when they're just being introduced to it, you've got all the work behind you. You've done all of that already. And now you're trying to draw them in. And with that, with a good quality photograph, you can do that. Without it, it starts to, it's harder to get them to the point of paying attention to what you've done and all of the work that you've put in.
And I'm looking forward to a full session with you, Kate, where we can look at how to actually achieve that and how we can use our cameras, even if we're taking on, on a phone, to create the best result we can from the photographs instead of just defaulting to whatever, lineups of people is what I think of generally, right? Groups of people standing with their arms straight and smiling all together is kind of the most common, I think, kind of photograph that we get. And it doesn't really tell much of a story, right? It just says, here's what the people looked like on this day, as opposed to helping to connect to a story about who they are and what they do and what they've learned and how they're participating in our work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The equipment that you have, I mean, these days, phone photographs are really, phone photographs are about as good as any photograph that you would have gotten in the early 2000s with a professional camera. So that quality is available to a lot more people now. The trade-off, of course, is that the standards for, in the audience have spiked quite a bit, but we can certainly go over how to use whatever you've got to get the images that are going to really show your work in the best light, if you'll excuse the pun.
Great. And then, of course, once you have a photograph, thinking strategically about the size, like how big should it be, little teeny little photographs that people can barely see in the, buried in a corner of a page aren't going to be as effective as something that's bigger, big enough for people to really see and focus on. Where you locate images in a report or in a PowerPoint slide, for example, is really important because that's where people's eyes are going to go. So thinking about where you want them looking and what other information on that page or that screen you want them to be connecting with are good considerations. So here's a photograph. Kate, did you take this photograph?
I did.
I butchered it by cropping it, I'm sure. But
No, it's fine.
So this is a lovely photograph taken by Kate when she visited Josephine in Kenya I think it's a couple of years ago at this point. But yeah. Josephine, this is a wonderful case study we could include in a donor report about Josephine and her children. Josephine participated in a livelihoods project where she learned new skills, was able to start a new business that she could run from her home while also being a caregiver to these children. Good news is the kids are growing up healthy. Both girls have been in school full-time for the last 2 years. Wonderful story, right? And here's Josephine. They look happy and healthy and everyone's doing well. Nothing wrong with that photograph. But fortunately, this project partner thought ahead. And we also have this picture. Now, this photograph is not as good quality. You can see the resolution is not as good as this beautiful one that Kate took. But I think the before and after here is really helpful because you want to tell a story of Josephine and her 2 children and the struggles and challenges that Josephine was experiencing raising those 2 children in the slum community of Kibera in Nairobi, Kenya, and how important accessing these livelihood supports was to Josephine to be able to start a business, to be able to provide for those children and ensure that those kids grew up healthy and happy and were able to attend school. I think the visual impact of seeing Josephine and her children before and seeing Josephine and her children later is really powerful. And probably a reader of reading your report could read Josephine's story, but what they're going to remember is the difference between how that family looked before and how that family looks now, and the impact that that project has had on this particular family is going to be much more powerful if you've got the photographs. So other ways There are lots of ways that we can use visuals to support our storytelling and beyond just photographs, okay? Charts and graphs are also a very common way that we use to present data evidence that support our story, okay? The advantage of charts and graphs is that it allows us to present a lot of information in a really succinct way. It can help make the information we're sharing, the data we're sharing, easier to understand. Can also make it harder to understand depending on the charts or graph that you use. We'll look at that in a second. But it can combine a lot of information in a very quick way, right? So if you want to report on, you know, the percentage of people that demonstrated improved knowledge after a training, putting a little chart in there is great. You can be like, here's our proof, here's what the data said. And then you can focus your words on talking about why it matters, the so what and the now what, and the humanizing part of what that really means and why we should care that people learned these things, right? But it can illustrate the point that you're making. So if you're talking about the training was successful, and then you've got a nice little chart or graph that shows the evidence that the training was successful, those two pieces then reinforce each other. Some considerations in the use of charts or graphs are, you know, trying to think about how you can streamline your charts and graphs to make your point, as opposed to having the reader have to sit and look at it for a really long time to understand what it means, okay? Using limited colors so that it's not, you know, too jarring, right? If you're reading it and you're like, whoa, what is all of this? It's too much visual, can actually be confusing as opposed to making it easy to understand. Use text to explain what you're trying to show in the chart or visual. Don't expect people to try to figure it out on their own or have to read through all of your narrative text to understand what they're looking at in the chart or graph. And then you can think about when it's appropriate to integrate charts and graphs into, say, the narrative of your reporting, and when it's appropriate to use an appendix or annex or a dashboard or something where you can show the data visually, but not necessarily detract from the story you're writing in your reporting. Okay, so charts and graphs, I'm going to caution, can be super helpful, but they can also be confusing noise that confuses what you're trying to communicate, depending on how they're used. So here's an example. This is using just a built-in chart. This is one that Microsoft thinks is helpful for us to use. And if you choose a simple pie chart that's looking at the level of agreement about whether agroforestry training was helpful for this farming. So we've asked participants in the training whether they thought the training was helpful. And this is what it looks like in a pie chart. Is this helpful? Is this easy for you to understand? What do you think of this pie chart? So not very many people have their cameras on today, but those that do have their cameras on are doing what people always do when I show this slide, which is leaning closer to your screen, furrowing your eyebrows, and actually kind of having to do a little bit of work to understand what this means, right? So if you think about if this pie chart was in a report that you're reading, and you're reading, and you get to this pie chart, and it's like a big stop sign. You stop, you lean in, and you furrow your eyebrows, and you try to understand what it means. And now you're off the story. You're over here somewhere thinking about this pie chart, and you're no longer absorbed in the story. You're not following the story anymore, right? What if it looked like this?
I think this tells story clearer, better. without even having to stress yourself getting to see the explanation around it. Just looking at it, you can get to understand what the story is all about and the various results that come out from it. I think this is clear.
Now, this is completely stripped back to just the information that supports the point you're making. You could add in, you could have the percentage for each of these three options in there if you wanted. There are other things you could add back in. But a good rule of thumb when you're thinking about the charts is start with only what is required to make your point. Instead of having a title, use text to explain the visual. So people look at the text, they look at the visual, they're, yeah, it makes sense, and they move on, right? And then add back in only what you think is going to be helpful or of particular interest to any donor, okay? We're also going to do, we've decided, just like we did the last, in relation to budgeting and monitoring and evaluation, we did a special session in Excel where we looked at how to use Excel to support those things. I think we're also, in addition to the training that Kate's going to offer about photography, we're also going to do a training later in the spring on using Excel to make charts and graphs. And part of what we're going to talk about is how you can go take a pie chart from this to something closer to this, or in various places in between, so you can know how to actually use the tool to make your charts and graphs speak the way you want them to speak and make the points you want them to make, okay? We'll keep you posted of that as well. Here's another one. This is showing improvement in CAP scores, so knowledge, attitudes, and practice, so pre-training, post-training, to show that people did actually learn something through the project. You got it broken down by age and gender. This is the built-in one that Microsoft will produce for you. In this case, I'm showing
too clumsy, preparing too many information for people to understand.
Mm-hmm. So in this case, using this chart, these people are not really important to the point we're trying to make, because in this case. So in this case, I've highlighted this one down here because clearly it's an outlier. So I don't know if you noticed that when you looked at the first chart, sort of, well, what happened here? Who are those women? Why are they up down here and everyone else is up here by the end? What was different about their experience? So in this case, I'm showing how you can use a chart, this visual, to help to highlight an outlier or something you've learned. Okay, so this was a problem. This was a challenge. But in fact, it takes that by zooming in a little bit, it focuses not on the fact that these women didn't experience the project in the same way as others, but it's showing the good news that in fact, that was noticed at the midline and corrections were taken, and in fact, improvement has been made. So it takes sort of a bad news outlier story, provides additional context, and actually leaves a reader feeling like, oh, okay, the problem was actually being solved. You see? So we'll get into this in much more detail in a later training. But the point I just want to make today is that don't just think about yes or no, should we use a chart or a graph? You have to go beyond that and think about how are we going to use a chart or a graph effectively to help tell the story, to help the reader to understand something about our project work, okay? Here's an example of how you could show data in a dashboard. So if you really do want to show, the raw data. You want to show you've done your research and this was a rigorous monitoring and evaluation process. You can show all of that in an annex to a project report, okay? So that you can focus the report itself on telling the story, making the points that you want to make, and helping the reader to understand what happened and what you want them to do next, while still achieving that that sense of we've got all the data and we're going to show you the technical data as well. Okay, so depending on your audience, think about whether it's appropriate to integrate all of this into the body of your reporting, or whether this is a separate piece that you can use as backup for the information and the story you've shared in the report itself. Okay. Another type of visual that we might use are including images of samples of a work. So you might include a sample drawn out of the training module you're using. You could use a diagram or maps to show process or change. You might, in your report, just like you might in a proposal, actually use like a visual diagram of your theory of change. If you think back to that very first training session we did, okay? These are useful for helping people to get that kind of behind the scenes access to the technicals of what's actually going on in the project. You can use them to show before and after. You can use them for illustrating context, okay? Considerations might be licensed use. So if you're wanting to share a piece of a training module or diagrams or that, making sure you have permissions to be sharing those things. And then also thinking whether it's actually adding value to the story that you're telling, or is it just creating visual noise? And whether it's appropriate, right, to that audience, whether it's actually going to be helpful. So here's an example of an image that's not a photograph of a person. Okay, it's not a chart or a graph, but it is a visual. It's a piece of art that a child has made, okay, about their hopes and dreams, okay? This is a different way. You can show a photograph of the child and as a case study, but this is also a really compelling way to get people to connect to children, right? If you're trying to get them to connect to the experience of children in your project, having them connect with the fact that children are children, and this might look like, even though the child themselves might not look like the child of the person, the stakeholder that's reading your report, they might connect more with a piece of art like this that reminds them of a piece of art their child maybe has made, right? Or children that they know may have made. It helps to create that emotional or human connection. Here's another example. Here are 3 different diagrams that could be used to help stakeholders understand ventilated pit latrine technology. Maybe you're doing a project and it's a sanitation project, and here's 3 different versions of a diagram that could be useful depending on the audience. Does anybody want to take a stab at thinking about which audiences might respond best to these 3 different versions? When would each of them be appropriate, or are there some that maybe are not appropriate at all?
The third one is most likely, because it shows that the benefit is for human being, and I mean, we can see that the ultimate aim is just to get a toilet for people for their use. So, and we have seen somebody and we have seen the usage. So I think people will relate more with the third image than with the first and the second, which looks more like an architectural design and things like that.
Yeah.
I think maybe the two first ones are more like, I don't know, kind of technical people that really matters. What are the kind of materials that you are using there and how is effective? Maybe the first one is more from technical. The second one it's maybe the person who are doing, because it has the measures. And the last one I think is what you can kind of using a report that it's not a technical report, but it's just explaining how it works.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say too, when you think about the interests, right, or of the different stakeholder audiences. Yeah, I mean, if it's that you want to help someone understand how it works in terms of the airflow and how odors and flies go out and that, you might use this one. If you want, if it's someone that is more interested in construction or building, knowing that it's an 11-centimeter vent pipe might be important technical information for them, but for most people that means nothing. I can't imagine what that is or what that looks like. The third one might not be appropriate for a very formal audience, but if your idea is to get someone to be interested in a pit latrine, which not everybody might, you know, going in saying, oh, I'm going to read this report about a pit latrine. That's not that exciting, but hey, that makes it look interesting. I'm engaged by that. I'm kind of intrigued about this, right? So it's just thinking through these different diagrams, and the way you present diagrams could be appropriate or used in different ways. The last one is using sort of icons or design elements, little you know, visualizations of things like timelines or processes. Helping to can be really helpful if you want people to understand sort of the theory of change or the process that or approach that you used in a project. Using visuals can also mean about how you use color and how you use size to guide people's eyes to the content that you want them to connect with. Okay. You'll notice this is something I have been doing throughout the presentation, right? So you can see right now we're talking about icons and design elements, but your eyes are drawn over here. This is the call out box that you're probably looking at when you're looking at this slide. And this is the content that I really want you to be thinking about. This is really just the outline, right? So these are some examples using little call outs, using bold font, using color and size of text is also a way of integrating visuals to help make your point, to help make your content flow, to help people connect with what you're sharing with them. Okay, some considerations are color scheme. You use too many different colors on in one page, it can be confusing and people don't know where they're supposed to look, and they might not actually read and consider all of the different information. Okay, being consistent is just visually pleasing, just helps people to feel comfortable. If you see the same slide layout over and over again, you know what to do. Your eyes have already figured it out, and instinctively you now know where to go to get the information because it's been consistent. Okay, you can think about your brand. So depending on the audience that you're sharing your story with, how are you integrating the colors or logos or things that are consistent for your organization in your communications more broadly? And then how can you use these pieces to help create a really professional look and feel to what you're doing? Okay, here's an example of a lovely little flow chart that Katie designed for a project that was showing the timeline of an implementation plan. This little line here is there because that's where they are at this point in time in the implementation plan. Okay, so your eye probably caught that red pretty quickly, right? Got your attention, told you that this was somehow important. And you should look at that piece of the visual. Okay. Any questions at all about visuals? And of course, this is recorded. This will be shared as well. So maybe you want to come back to it in 6 months or a year when you're going into your reporting phase of your project. But I guess some key takeaways that I just really want to drive home that I think are good sort of best practices for thinking about being successful and really using your impact reporting effectively, to know your audiences and their needs. Use your data to develop your impact stories so that the story you're telling is evidence-based. It's from what you've learned through your monitoring and evaluation plan. And you're going to translate that into a story that you can tell. Picking the formats that are appropriate to your audiences. Use a storytelling approach to make any of the reporting you're doing more compelling and more impactful for the reader or for the audience that's receiving the report. And then think about how you can use visuals strategically to illustrate your impact in a way that supports the story that you're trying to tell.
And this is a bit delayed here, but there have been some comments throughout while you're speaking, Claire, talking about video.
Yeah.
And where you can, try and use video, because it's just as powerful as a picture. And you can even, and it brings you in even sometimes more than a picture can, because you can, it's almost like you can be there live with the people. So if you can do a little case study, say 1 minute case study as a video, you speaking to somebody, then that can also be a really powerful way to draw your audience in, especially if you're trying to communicate with people who are, you know, a good distance away from the project or where it's happening. So say you're trying to speak with people who are here in Canada and your project's happening in Colombia. So you might want to have a video that can bring people to where it is, right? And feel like they're there with it. So there's been a couple of comments about that. I just wanted to acknowledge and say, if anyone wants to talk more about videos and how you've used them, then this is a good chance for that.
I think that's great. And I think one thing I would add about video, just since it's flagged in my mind, is the nice thing about video, and I'm talking about today, like in the year 2021, is some of the things that people expect, I think, from static images that Kate's going to help us accomplish, right? Of professional, really good quality images. People don't have that same expectation, generally speaking, of video. And this is especially true, most likely, of donor audiences too. Anyone who's using social media and say technology like Zoom, we are now really accustomed to seeing video and moving people and faces and scenes in a way that's not really slick and professional, right? The selfie video, the TikTok, anyone on TikTok generation, but even just people getting used to doing Zoom meetings and seeing people like this, right? We're used to seeing people just on video a lot now, which means you can use that in a really effective way without worrying about it being professionally edited and nice music in the background and everything being really, you know, professional. Video can be a way to provide a real human story and context in a way that's relatively easy to achieve and can actually just be achieved on a phone with a selfie, right? A selfie view of, hey, here I am. We're at the training. Everyone say hi. We're sitting here at the training today. It's going to be a great session. Can't wait to share with you afterwards about everything we've learned. Nice little video. You post that to your website. You send it by email to some stakeholders. And then when they get your report, they've been looking forward to it. They're like, oh yeah, I wonder how that training did go. You know, it can be a way to do really effective engagement that's kind of feels real and personal and relatively easy to achieve and affordable. Yeah, you don't need to pay for fancy technology to do that anymore.
Yeah, it's very true, Claire. And you touched on this a bit, but you don't need long videos either. You know, I think 15 seconds for most mediums are going, or most media are going to get you there, get the attention of your audience and make them feel very much like they know you, they know your participants, and they know what the project does.
Yeah. And if you think about, if you just imagine for a second, one of those standard photographs of after the training, everyone stand together as a group, arms by your side, static image of here's our training, as opposed to a 3-second video. Everyone wave and say hi, and then it's a moving people, and people are smiling and waving and being people. The impact of those two is very different, right?
And
Great.
if you can do meetings live now that people are used to using Zoom and meeting platforms like this, some of our CAP network partners have been arranging live meetings with supporters and participants, or supporters and staff, sometimes using them as fundraising opportunities. So I think people are used to meeting virtually now, so you can see how you can make use of that for reporting, for keeping people in touch, for fundraising even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anybody else have any final thoughts or anything they'd like to share?
There was also one other question in the chat about protecting the dignity and privacy of the people that you photograph
Yeah.
or take video of. That is a massive topic, especially right now. Since a lot of NGOs and charities have joined Instagram and Facebook, it's gone from, you take a photograph of someone and you print that and send it off in the mail to your donors, to now that same image is open to the web and kind of anyone can access it. So it is really important for sure that you get informed consent from the people that you photograph, and that's something else that I'll be talking about in the photography session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. We also, Katie, can we make a note to, in the folder, in the participant folder, we'll drop in, CAP Network has a consent template that we use. So we'll drop that in there that you can sort of take a look at, and maybe you don't already have something like that in place, you might want to adopt something, you can feel free to just use ours or copy and paste or make it your own. But we'll put that in there as a sample as well.
But I just want to say thank you, really. It has been an amazing training. I learned a lot. And also thank you for all your feedback. Really, it's welcome. And I think this kind, I like it so much, your approach, because you try not just living in the theory, but try to help us to apply all what we were working here or trying to learn in our project. So thank you so much, really. It has been an amazing time that I have shared here with you.
Thanks, Diana. That's lovely feedback. Thank you. Okay. Well, it's been really a pleasure. Thank you all so much for being a part of the training. And please don't see today as being the end. As far as next steps, we are still available to help review any of your project builder content, or if you are at the point where you've started to think about a concept note, when you have that ready, run it by us, right? We can be a friendly friendly audience to review and let you know what we think, and maybe help strengthen it before you start sending it out to people with money and get your projects funded. And as always, we're always here, and please keep in touch so that we can follow what's happened. So if you get funding, let us know. We all want to be inspired by that, to see what's happened with some of the projects we've all gotten to connect with a little bit here. And then of course we do have other trainings outside of this project Accelerator series that will be running throughout the year. So please do stay in touch, and I hope we'll get to see you again at some subsequent trainings as well.
I think it would be a disservice if I didn't say something too. Please permit me to say something. Like I said earlier on, I'm just a novice. No any experience working for any NGO anywhere before. I've been a teacher for almost 2 decades. But I have passion for humanitarian. I founded the environment club in my former school. We planted trees. I joined so many environmental clubs and people doing peace and things like that. So I think out of curiosity, I just stumbled on this program and I said, okay, let me join. Let me just give it a try. And I must confess that just like I said the other time, if there is anything at all that has so impressed me, that has been a big eye opener for me, I think it is that logic model. It is that logic model because it just make everything explicit. I mean, it's whether you are talking of the monitoring and evaluation, whether you are talking about whatever it is that we follow up, if you have gotten that one right, it simplifies the whole activity till the end. But if you miss it from that point, I doubt if there is anything you can do to make it's, I mean, really, it's not just to have learned how to even deliver lessons to people, because you are a wonderful teacher, and Katie has been a very, very fantastic facilitator. I mean, sending the mail, sending the reminder and things like that, and being on our neck, oh, please do this, do that. I think it's a wonderful experience. Thank you so much. And we continue to build on the relationship. It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure working with you. Great. One other thing, I think Katie put it in the chat box, but if it would be helpful for any of you to receive a certificate of completion so that you have that to say that you've participated in the training, Katie will be facilitating that. So just get in touch with Katie and she can make sure you get that. Katie, I think, is also going to be sending out a link to a feedback survey. We also want to do our own monitoring and learning about the series. So we do really appreciate in advance the time you take to fill that out and share with us the good and the bad, because obviously, you know, we're not perfect, and we'd really appreciate any feedback that you can provide that can help us learn from this experience and make sure that we can do even better for the next Accelerator series as well. So thank you in advance for doing that so that we can learn and grow. And I really wish you all the very best of luck with the work that you're doing, and all the success in the world. Thank you so much.
It's fantastic. Thank you.